we'll get started and maybe some folks will join us along the way, or maybe we just have a little cozy group. Welcome to this session that we've titled How We Think and How We Behave. It's really important as we work to advance racial equity in all of the different places that our lives and our advocacy touch, that we understand not just our history, but also to understand the way that our brains work and why we act the way that we do, and how sometimes the way that we act is maybe counter to the things that how we think we should. So we're going to take just a couple minutes to introduce ourselves, sort of lay the framework for how we hope we all can show up today, and then we'll jump in. So my name is Mo Young. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. The lens that I bring to this work, I am a biracial Black person. I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a mother, I'm an auntie. I am an adventurer. You can see that with the bird on my head. And I live in Oregon. I'm also a CASA volunteer. We call what you do CASAs down in Oregon. So that middle picture is of me being an advocate. And then Erin.
Hey everybody, my name is Erin Drury. I use she, her, and her pronouns. And I am in Washington, although I did work with CASA in Oregon in a prior life before I moved up here to Seattle. I'm also a mother and a daughter, and importantly to me, a dog mom dedicated to rescuing pit bulls. And an active community member. The one pictures of my run for school board, which I did not win, learned a lot from, but was the interim school board member and remain an active community member in public education as well. And then also the picture there of my kiddo and the tree behind us. I don't know if you can see it super well, but there are candles on that tree, real live fire candles. And that is my Dutch heritage, which also means that by definition, I am a colonizer and come from colonizers in this country. So this, from that lens, I'm reminded to constantly be curious and learning, to expand my thinking, to include all bodies and all minds. And that one of my main values in life is that when we make decisions, we have to do so with accountability to our future generations. So that's a bit about me and my background here. We're going to ask you all to please, in the chat, write some about yourself. So if you could, in the chat, please write your name and your pronouns and where you're joining us from. If you happen to know the native lands of which you're on, including that would be fabulous. Like I said, I'm in Seattle, which is on the Coast Salish and Duwamish lands. What your role at Child Advocates is. Are you an advocate? Do you fill different roles? How many kiddos do you have in that role? How long you've been an advocate? And what has drawn you to this workshop this afternoon? Or what are you excited about learning here? So I'll give you a minute or two to be able to type and think and not have to try and do that and listen. And then we'll keep going. Jen, yeah, please. See your hand up. Nope. Thanks, Betty. We've got some longtime advocates here. I love it. Thanks, folks, for getting that information out. Hopefully you can read a little bit about the fellow advocates in the room here as well through here. Got someone looking forward to your first case. That's fun. Love it. Thanks. Okay, well, as folks keep putting that information in there, we have a few requests for how we show up in this space together today. So I'm just going to walk through them. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand, type it in the chat, just come off mute. I'm good with interruptions. That's all good. So if anything, if you'd like any more explanation on anything, feel free. So first of all, we are going to expect and accept non-closure. So we're looking for learning and progress, and a lot of the topics around bias in our behaviors and race and racism in our work can bring up questions and may not be tied up into a neat bow at the end of the training today, and that's okay. We're going to keep learning, and we're going to keep asking questions, and we're going to keep growing as individuals. We are going to center Black, Brown, and Indigenous truths, experience, and joy, and disrupt and dismantle white supremacy and anti-Blackness. That is our guiding principle and guiding light throughout all of this. We're also interested in intent as opposed to impact. We must acknowledge that the impact of what we say and our actions, regardless of the intent of how we meant them to land. So if somebody says to you, "Ooh, that hurt," like what you said hurt me, you say, "Thank you for sharing that. How can I do better? How can I learn better? How can I support you?" Because the impact is more important. We're also going to be mindful of airspace. We are going to have opportunities to engage through chat, through breakout rooms, through conversation. We just want to make sure that we're aware of our power dynamics that upholds racism and silence Black, Brown, and Indigenous and folks of color. So to just be very aware of how we're showing up in that space. Then also, these are the last three here, both and multiple things can be true at the same time. So everyone, we all bring our own experience and lived expertise. And so we want to hear the truth of what's being said instead of looking for the exceptions to the case. So if somebody shares a personal experience, we're not going to say, "Oh, but," we're going to accept that truth for as it is. We also want to participate to our fullest ability, which means you need to take care of your own self and your own needs. If you are comfortable having your camera on, that's amazing. If you are more comfortable having your camera off, that's amazing. If you need to go get a drink of water, use the restroom, whatever, please take care of yourself. We do have a few opportunities of breaks in here, but if that doesn't align with your needs, please do take care of yourself. And also, we're going to ask you to take some risks and be willing to be wrong. So we're going to ask for you for participation and hope that you can do so fully knowing that you can be brave in this space and show up and take those risks. And then lastly, as hopefully you are probably as advocates and GALs used to, this is a confidential space. So we will not be sharing quotes or stories that you heard here, but you can most definitely, and please do, share any themes or learnings or broad spectrum ideas that you're still thinking about. We want you to engage in your community and with your friends and family and other advocates throughout all of this. So please do take those forward. Does that all jive with folks? Can I have a thumbs up if that is like, yep, I'm on track, either through your reaction button or just awesome. And just in case, I think we all know how to do this, but there are reaction buttons on your toolbar. Okay, that you can put a thumbs up or raise your hand. Do multiple things. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So with that, we are going to dive right in. I'm handing it back to you, Mo. And you're muted, just heads up.
Look at me go. I got so excited. We're going to start by sort of painting a big picture and then really hone in on our focus for today. So we're going to talk about the different types of racism. Racism is often thought of as individual acts of bias. And while discrimination is still very much a reality, focusing on individual acts of racism can obscure the institutional and structural realities that create and maintain inequities more broadly. So the inequities that we see in all of our work. So to fully address the impacts of racism, it's important to address institutional and structural biases at the same time as we're addressing our individual biases. And I'd like to just share 3 different definitions of what racism is so that we can all be on the same page about what we're talking about. So individual racism is prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual based on race. And we'll dig into that a little bit more in just a minute. Institutional racism are the policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, often unintentionally or inadvertently. I work in public health and I see that every day. Structural racism is the history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions. And this combines to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color at a disparate rate of white communities. So let's imagine that what this looks like in our everyday lives. I'm going to borrow the model that Race Forward, a national policy and advocacy organization, uses to tie these together. And I just want to say first, let's imagine that we're all like physically in the same room, because this makes a lot more sense if we imagine that. Individual racism is the room that we're all sitting in. It's our immediate context. Institutional racism is the building that this room is in. It's the policies and practices that dictate how we live our lives. And structural racism is the skyline of the buildings all around us, all of which interact to dictate our outcomes. And today we're going to focus on individual racism and specifically, or more specifically, implicit bias. Next slide. So there are 2 different types of bias that we want to just sort of shine a light on. Explicit bias is expressed directly. A person is aware of their bias and the bias operates consciously. You can think of before the civil rights movement when landlords would post signs in their windows of who they would or would not rent to. That's an example of explicit bias. Implicit bias is indirect. The person is generally unaware of their bias and it operates subconsciously. An example might be a property manager doing more criminal background checks on African Americans and whites. It also could be a caseworker removing kids of color at a higher rate as white children. With implicit bias, a person might consciously reject prejudice and stereotypes, and yet has these stories and narratives running in the background, causing them to make decisions that are contrary to their actual beliefs. Next slide. Another example, think about what you consider when you purchase a home. So that could be location, schools that are nearby, walkability. All of this is structure, and policies have created these structures. Where you live is shaped by policies in place. So mortgages, different types of housing that is allowed to be built, the closeness of the houses. So it's shaped by policies in place and how close it is to good schools, transportation, food, etc. This is a holistic view of our lives, and it's these institutions combined that create structure and determine the health of the people and whole communities. If you don't have one of the things that you see in that image, the impact is felt across the rest of your life. So in this example that you see on the screen, if you don't have good public transit, that may limit your ability to access a job, see a doctor when you're sick, get your kid to an appointment, get your kid to or from school. And all of those will have negative outcomes that down the road could culminate in kids getting taken away and a variety of other consequences. Next slide. So before we move on, I just want to talk for a minute about equity in the community. Our institutions are organized around services. So the housing department focuses on housing, school district is focused on education, police department is focused on criminal justice, but people, real people, lead whole lives. And what we know that is that if a family is experiencing homelessness, their kids are less likely to be doing well in school. And if their kids are less likely to be doing well in school, they're less likely to get a good job when they get out, and so on and so on. So think of the work that you do as child advocates. If a family doesn't have access to the health care and mental health care that they need, they may find themselves unable to care for their children because of a physical or mental health issue that could have been avoided. If they don't have access to safe housing because of the built environment that surrounds the apartment that they grew up in or they're currently living in, they may have their children removed for that lack of safe and stable housing. There are so many systemic things that can contribute to a family's involvement in the child welfare system. It's important that we all take responsibility for where we have power and influence. And for us here today, that means learning about what implicit bias is and how it can affect the work that we do as advocates and how we can reduce it in our interactions.
So, what does all of this mean? And how is this working in our brains? So our minds are constantly working at both a conscious and unconscious level. While we are often operating at the conscious level, our subconscious mind is still working, using 3 processes to make sense of this information. One is sorting into categories, creating associations between things, and filling in the gaps when we only receive partial information. These 3 processes together add up to schemas, the frames through which our brains help us understand and navigate the world. Can you, for a second, think about an example of some sorting and association and gap filling that you might go through on a regular daily basis? Like, for example, if you eat something that is a new meat to you, and then you say, oh, this tastes like chicken. You're creating that broad spectrum association to relate to other folks so that they have a basis or understanding of what it is that you're experiencing, right? So you've sorted this into a category of a meat, you're creating an association to a meat that you've had, and then you're filling in the gaps because it's something that you've never had before. And so you're relating it to something that you have. If you're willing and able, please write into a chat another example that you may have of something, of a time that you're just very quickly, your brain's doing something easily in that manner. Or if you like to talk and you want to hear someone else's voice, also, feel free to come off mute. New songs, yeah.
I think that when I'm driving, I'm always sorting things into categories and trying to create associations to keep myself safe.
Oh, for sure. Yep. You don't read every sign when you're driving, right? You just know the yellow ones are like, oh, I should probably pay attention. And the red, yep, for sure. New smells. How many times have you smelled something that like automatically takes you back to a different memory? Excellent. Thanks. And you can keep typing if you want, if things come to your brain as they do. So these schemas help us organize information into broader categories. Meanings associated with those categories are then activated. Schemas are social. They exist in our environment, language, metaphors, etc. For example, for meat eaters in the room, as we've already talked about, when you said something tastes like chicken, I do find this example hilarious because I haven't had meat in over 30 years. But I still, like, as a vegetarian, if I eat something that is vegetarian, particularly now that we have new meats, like fake meats, when I'm talking to meat eaters, I could say that still to this day. So these are like, they stick with you, just for reference here. Schemas play a particularly significant role when there's nope, that word's not going to happen for me. No, that's like one of those
ambiguity.
Words. Thank you. Can't say. So a lack of information. if there's stress for completing tasks, if there's a time pressure, or if there's underrepresentation for a group in question. If we think of this on a personal level, as advocates, you're in a cluster of all of those things often, right? There's often a lack of information. You're often under stress for completing, getting all the information you do need on a time pressure and under pressure. And the groups that we tend to represent as advocates are underrepresented groups. So the unconscious is not just an individual or internal phenomenon. We've all been socialized to think about race within categories, generalizations, or stereotypes. For example, if my primary exposure to Latinos or Latinx folks growing up was by Speedy Gonzalez, it's going to continue to reside in my unconscious mind, that association. We could go through a list of stereotypes by race and quickly as a group be able to name common stereotypes about all races, which we're not going to do. Instead, we're going to categorize and show how our brain does this quickly and on its own through another example. So what I'm going to do is put up in order a list of different words and that are in different colors. And what I want you to do is quickly say the color to yourself. You could say it out loud. You're all muted, actually. Quickly say the color out loud that you see. Okay?
Red, black, blue, green.
There you go. All right, now I want you once again to say the color of the following lines of text. Ready?
Wait, what was the instruction?
Say the color again as you see it. So black was the first
Black,
one.
red, blue.
Black, red, blue.
Green.
Green.
And if you want to come off mute and participate, please do. We can actually be in space together. It is okay. All right. And we're going to do this another time here. I want you to say the color of the line that comes up. Okay, ready?
Mm-hmm. Green.
Red,
Red.
Red,
blue,
Red.
blue,
black,
Black.
blue, green,
Green. Black. Green.
Yep. So as we heard, it got a little trickier when the word that you were reading was different color than the color that you were seeing, right? So on the first line here, it says green, but the color you were seeing was red. And your brain subconsciously categorizes so quickly that it's very hard for us to say the color different than the word that we're reading, right? And this happens with race as well. We've all been socialized to think about race, and some of that plays out on conscious levels, but sometimes it also plays out often on an unconscious level. Okay, so we are going to take a quick little break here. We're trying to get people to not have to stare at your screen all the time. So take 2 minutes, and then we're going to come back and we're going to keep digging further and further into all of this. So we will see you back here at 1:28 or 9.
We're going to share a little video with you all. Some of you might have seen it. It's been around for a handful of years. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. And the focus on this video really is identifying the danger of letting our implicit biases take the lead, not just the danger of what might happen to others if we allow our implicit biases to tell us the stories of all the people that we run into, but also what we might miss out on. So let's see, it's just shy of 19 minutes long. We're gonna watch it, and then we'll come back together and we'll talk about it. We'll try to talk about it in a large group. If that doesn't work, then we'll put y'all into breakout rooms. Erin's gonna get us started.
Cuando no dejas de retarte, ni el
There's an
cielo
ad
es el
for us
límite.
real quick.
Honda.
How's the size?
Can you make it full screen?
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler and Updike and Steinbeck and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who walked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I'm confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
How many of you are familiar with this video? Maybe raise your hand or put a chat. So a handful. This is one of my favorites. I think I hear something different in it every time that I listen to it. We're gonna take just a few minutes in a breakout room. We're gonna pair you off. And we're gonna have you answer the questions that Erin just put in chat. So we're gonna ask you to, you don't have to share the times unless you want to, but think of a time that someone made an assumption about you. Think of a time when you made an assumption about somebody else. And then the part that we want you to really dig into is what happened and what do you wish had happened differently. We're going to give you like 7 to 8 minutes together to do that. And Erin's going to send you to your break rooms now. All right. Welcome back, friends. I'm going to ask folks to share just sort of general themes of what y'all talked about. And I can't see all your faces, A, because not all your cameras are on, but B, because I can only see 4 of you at a time. So feel free just to unmute and
I think one of the themes that came out with us was that the second that somebody's assumed something negative about you, it's like it kind of brings you back to, oh my gosh, I really need to watch my assumptions because I'm assuming stuff about other people. And so, I need to check myself because that didn't feel good at all.
yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of a bummer reminder too, like, oh man, someone just assumed that about me. And now not only is there like an assumption I have to, fight against, I also have to check myself. What else did people talk about?
We recognized that assumptions weren't always negative, but could be just as detrimental. And an example was you see a really happy, what you perceive as a really happy couple at a party, only to find out later that really life wasn't that happy, but they put on a great facade.
Yeah. Yeah, people only show us what they want us to see.
I shared that I've been trying to turn my assumptions around, trying, because I was a nurse for 40 years and we have a lot of assumptions about people. It's just what happens, oh, the appendectomy over in bed 12 and that kind of thing. But so when I see somebody walking down the street, instead of like thinking, oh my gosh, how can they be wearing that, I try and think how brave they are to wear that, or it's just try and turn that everyday thing into something that's not what I assumed before or what I thought before, just trying to change those thoughts. It really does take effort.
Yeah, that's awesome. What else did folks talk about? My goal was that 4 of you would talk and 3 of you have talked. So please help me.
We talked a little bit about about assumptions made about people who, like in protest movements or things like that, or involved in different communities, and what assumptions people make and how harmful that can be, particularly like in a religious environment, like at a church or something like that. So
Yeah.
Well, just for spite, I think I'll mention what we talked about a little bit. So Mo, you don't have to feel like it was just barely the minimum.
Thank you.
It was very interesting to think about somebody else's misconceptions or assumptions, because I was so busy trying to figure one out for myself. And then when I was listening to Anne, it was like, oh, okay, that puts this perspective in for me. And so it's not only just in specific stories, but it's in what's right in front of my face.
Yeah, I love that.
This is Betty Marcoux. Mo, just a comment. I am a former librarian and for a while professor of library science, and that what we're talking about is collection development. It's what we collect or what we don't. And we very often, I know librarians are struggling right now with those issues because there are so many people who are very black and white about yay, nay type of stuff and in collections. And so it's a world that we could all learn to do better.
Yeah, I'm like, tell me more. Books are like, I don't know. Don't get me started on books.
If there's time, I'd like to share a time when I made a very embarrassing assumption.
Yeah, there's time.
I live in Mason County, a rural area, and my older dentist retired and sold his practice. And so this was my first appointment with the new younger dentist, who I was told was a retired military person that was buying the practice. And so I went into the dentist, I sat in the chair, and there's a man in the room, and he has tattoos, you know, all the way up his neck, down both of his arms. He has his hair is in a ponytail down the middle of his back, and he has a beard. And so I'm thinking that's the equipment repair guy or the oxygen, something, you know. And then when he asked me to sit back and open my mouth, I said, "Who are you?" And it was my new dentist.
I'm jealous that that was your dad. I'd be so excited.
I never have thought of myself, but because I had these, you know, these preconceived notion, I think the word retired military sort of, you know, pushed me thinking in one, and because he wasn't wearing a white coat. But yeah, and I felt bad because I feel like he made a judgment on me then who I was, you know, because I made that assumption about him. So
Yeah, well, and your brain did exactly what it's supposed to do, right? We get all this input all day long, and if we don't sort people into categories and experiences into categories, we will be overwhelmed. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. Is he still your dentist?
no, actually, he sold his. He went in a partnership and sold out, and I'm not sure. I think he moved to another state, but no, not anymore.
Sorry to hear that. You know what's making me really happy, friends, is that as I scroll through your 4 faces at a time, I'm seeing a lot more cameras on. Thank you. It's easier to talk to not black squares. Does anyone want to share anything else about this video, about what y'all talked about? Okay. Let's go to the next slide then. So just sort of a caveat to this discussion is that if we're only thinking about biases as being perpetuated by individual actors explicitly, we lose significant ability to leverage change. And much like individuals, institutions have biases, and that's really, you know, for a variety of reasons, including that institutions are staffed by individuals, right? They're not made up of individuals, but the system is created, and then we all play our parts within that system. And race plays out on multiple levels, both implicitly and explicitly, consciously and subconsciously, both individually and institutionally. It's not just a matter of bad people having bad intentions. Next slide. So many of us tend to think about our thoughts and feelings as our own unique individual thoughts and feelings, but the reality is that our collective meaning is also at play. This includes everything from tastes like chicken to the intergenerational way in which stereotypes exist. If we look at a list of racial stereotypes from decades or even centuries ago, they would still seem quite familiar. This isn't to say that they're part of our conscious minds or that we would choose to have them be part of our subconscious. What brain research is showing us, though, is that only 2% of emotional cognition is available consciously. It's almost all playing out unconsciously, and racial bias tends to be in the unconscious network. We unconsciously have tapes or stories about race that are playing in the background of all of our thoughts all of the time, even when we're not discussing it. Next slide. So let's first think about bias. What even is it? Bias is a tricky topic. We're in a place in time where we have values for equality and justice. And as a result, there's often a tendency to say, I don't have bias or I don't see color. But of course, we all do see color and we all have biases. Bias is merely the evaluation of one group and its members relative to another. We all carry bias or prejudgment. Acting on biases can be discriminatory and can create negative outcomes for particular groups. there's been some great research into implicit bias, and we just wanted to share a few examples. I'm just going to go through the slide and then I'll go through my script. Affinity bias is looking at someone that we have something in common with and feeling a connection to that person because of the thing we have in common. So an example of that would be, you brought up tattoos on the dentist. I have lots of tattoos. I'm like, oh, cool, tattoo dentist. Who knows if we would get along, right? Perception bias is when we make stereotypes and assumptions based on someone's membership in a group that is different from us or a group that's different from one another. Halo effect is projecting positive qualities onto people without actually knowing them. So someone wrote in the chat earlier, making assumptions that beautiful people are also kind. Confirmation bias is looking to confirm our own opinions and pre-existing ideas. So once we make an assumption, it's often, well, I do at least, and I try not to, often I dig my heels in and try to just prove that my assumption is correct, right? So that would be the confirmation bias. And sometimes we are right and sometimes we're not. So for years, orchestras and symphonies had primarily male performers. And for many years, they tried to recruit female musicians, but with very little success. And so they did something different. They put the person auditioning behind a screen so that the conductor could only hear the music and not see the performer. There was a large immediate increase depending on the orchestra or symphony. The numbers range from 25 to 46% increase of female musicians being welcomed into the orchestra. But one researcher took it another step and looked at the impact of hearing somebody walk across the stage. Removing the influence of the sound of someone's footsteps and type of shoes, amazingly enough, meant an additional 10% increase in the number of women. So if a female musician was showing up wearing shoes with heels on them, those shoes made a sound that made people say, that's got to be a woman, and their implicit bias played out from then on. So this is an example of perception bias. When it comes to hiring processes and race, there have been a lot of studies that have documented the impacts. Candidates with more sort of white sounding names receive 50% more callbacks for jobs than those with African-American sounding names, even when the resumes were otherwise nearly identical or actually identical besides the name. Let's see. This study shows that there's more going on in hiring decisions than just merit, and that's an example of confirmation bias. So looking at someone's name, making assumptions about them, and then just working hard to confirm those assumptions. When researchers have gone back and shared with the HR managers, people have been really surprised and upset. They had no conscious intent to discriminate. It was playing out at the unconscious level. To counter this implicit bias, some companies have taken the step of removing names from resumes. So I just shared examples of confirmation bias and perception bias. I'm wondering if y'all could help me think of some examples of affinity bias or the halo effect. And if you could either unmute and shout it out or write it in the chat, that would be wonderful.
Well, having been a nurse, I think that people assume that, we're all in this together, us nurses, when actually that's not true. So, I'll assume you see a lot of like nurse strong and being nurses, and there are so many different people that are nurses that you really can't assume that just because they're nurses, they're similar to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
The same could be said about the military, that not everybody in the military is a hero. They're just regular folks who have a job to do. And they're just as biased and unbiased as the general population.
Yeah, thank you.
Someone in my group shared that they go to a particular church, and with all the occurrence, with the things in the political atmosphere right now, her fellow church member assumed that they had the same feelings about their political beliefs.
That's
Uh,
hard.
I changed directions for my profession in middle age, a little bit later middle age, from being a child advocate to being a psychologist. And I made an assumption doing the coursework and finding out all the things that need to be considered when being a psychologist, that those that worked as a psychologist just automatically had good skills and very comprehensive understanding and could pinpoint really well based upon fulfilling all of those things that you're learning you need to do in order to understand the needs of the client, and learning that I just wouldn't necessarily want to know some of those people. It was a big eye opener for me. The confirmation bias was not possible. I mean, I should say my confirmation acceptance changed dramatically from the bias that I had.
I love that. And I wish people talked about that exact one more, because there's also this assumption as someone who goes in to see a therapist that all therapists are, like you said, like capable of doing the things that you need them to. And that's not true, right? Like there is something to finding a good fit with a person that's providing you services. Yeah.
Same can be said for people who have advanced degrees, that just because you're got something more than a high school diploma, that somehow you're smarter, you're more keen or whatever.
No, I don't believe it. You can't.
Yeah,
make me
merit.
believe it.
Merit is a struggle. I mean, I work in public health, like I said. It's a struggle, the like degree versus experience, and
or just being empathetic. So what I was telling Anne in our pair thing that, where we were just talking to each other, I said, I'm overly educated. I have a law degree and I have a psychology degree. And that means nothing except I'm stubborn. I am stubborn enough to go through all of the steps in school to get the piece of paper. There's no assumptions to be made other than that.
That's what I say about me.
I love it. Well, I appreciate stubbornness, so I'm glad you're here.
And there's a question in the chat about financial bias. Not Betty, if you have a moment to expand on what the question is, that would be super helpful.
Sure. I wrestle with this every day because most of our kids are of a financial strata that we are not. And how do we work with that?
I have one comment and then I'm gonna ask you to expand. I believe that, I think as I'm looking at this slide, I think the thing that is closest to this idea of, we're in different financial, status is this perception bias. So having stereotypes and assumptions about different groups. I'm wondering what you mean about how do we work with that?
Well, I'm talking about as a guardian ad litem, we often encounter people who have, if they had the means, they would be doing different things, like their kids would be in different areas and so on and so forth. So we really have to look around and see what's available for them at their level, financial level. And often I worry that there's a financial bias there because we think of things that their kids could be doing or be involved in, and yet is there a bias there that we think those things are good and better than what they have in their own situations?
Yeah, I hear that. We spent a lot of time talking about that in my trainings down here in Lane County in Oregon, about how, like, the thing that sticks out to me the most is like safe and stable housing, right? So like if kids are removed then there's this requirement for safe and stable housing. And what I think is safe and stable housing, as someone who like owns a house and we all have our own rooms, is different than what is meant by safe and stable housing, right? Like there needs to be a bed for each child. Like, and so really checking our perceptions on what is a need, like what's really a need, and knowing what those are within the definitions set forth by the court, I would think would be one way that you work within that. And the other that comes to mind is really just like asking yourself as you're working with the kids and their families, like, is this a bias? Is this real, right? Just checking yourself, doing sort of your own checks and balances. I see Jennifer says tomorrow's topic is understanding poverty. So I would imagine that's also a really good place to ask that question.
I would agree on that. I think it has a lot to do with the food choices. We live in a world where financially, if we're able to afford food that's better for our bodies, than those kids that can't. And so what are we looking at there?
Yeah, and I guess I would push a little to say, and do those kids even live near places that can provide the food that we think they should be eating, right? So we talk a lot in public health about food deserts and access to healthy food, and how like entire neighborhoods are created where there is no grocery store. Where the only food that is affordable is fast food. And so I don't think, and this is just me speaking as me, I don't think we get to decide what folks eat. I think that we can, work with the city planners around like what's available, and we can like encourage, WIC to have the farmers market bucks, and there are ways to really help kids get access to food. But if the food's not available without driving, and I'm 9 years old and I am home by myself, like I'm gonna go across the street and get whatever it is I can, right?
Very often that is true.
What do other folks think about this?
Well, I had a case where the dad actually got the custody of the children, and I normally worked with mothers, and so that was a wonderful experience for me to get to see a dad involved and doing such a good job. But I was biased at first, thinking, I don't think this is going to work.
Awesome. Thank you. What else? Does anything come up for folks around financial bias? One of my least favorite things about facilitating is counting to 10 in my head. So thank you for your patience while I do that.
I want to comment on the requirement that each child has to have their own bed. If you are grown up in a large family, more than 5 kids, I thought it was kind of cool to be able to share a bed with the sibling. And we didn't have, full or queen beds. We had a twin bed, but that just meant, both sides of the bed was the headboard. One person's head was on one and one was the other. And that was until, we were probably 5 or 6. But, I think we didn't have room. You don't have room for everybody. If you have 6 kids in the family, you don't have room for everyone to have their own bedroom. We worked toward having all the females, all the sisters in one bedroom and all the brothers in another when we eventually had that much room. But so that's one thing. I've worked in public housing, and I'm so frustrated by the bias that people mismanage their money, and that's why they can't pay the rent. And by mismanaging your money, does that mean you chose to, fix your car or pay your car insurance, or fill a prescription that wasn't yet covered by your insurance? I mean, these are the tough choices. So those are the things that frustrate me when I hear people criticize someone for their financial failures.
Yeah. One of the things that you brought up, like, not only is the sharing bed and large families a really good example, but it's also often a cultural thing, right? And so if we're talking about providing culturally competent service to families, we also have to think about that. I'm going to move us to the next activity. We've got, we're going to have more opportunity to talk about just this stuff. So we're going to break it down with an example. And this is a real example from a police department that did this activity. And it's police officers who are working on racial equity within their department. And we're going to go from institutional explicit all the way down to individual implicit. So institutional explicit, these are policies that explicitly discriminate against a group. Those are illegal now, so we're less likely to see them. Doesn't mean we don't see them. An example would be a police department refusing to hire people of color. Institutional implicit biases are policies that negatively impact a group unintentionally. An example is the police department focusing on street-level drug arrests. Research has shown that white people and people of color use drugs roughly equally, with some drugs being more or less prevalent for some groups. However, every single step in the criminal justice system results in more and more disparity, starting with who gets arrested and continuing on to who gets charged, who gets prosecuted, who gets convicted, the sentences received, and the time served. So we start with equivalent drug use and end up with a huge racially disparate outcomes of who's coming out of the prison system. Starting with the beginning is important, who gets arrested, and it turns out there are some different patterns at play. So a question for you all is, how are white people more likely to do drugs or deal drugs? Like, in what way? What would their delivery method be?
There is a lot of drugs on college campuses, a lot of cocaine in finance. There's just the LA area, people making millions of dollars off of the movies that we see. Lots of drugs going on there. Another thing is that their kids are also not pulled into foster care, even though they're ignored and put into drug and sex parties. So yeah, there's a lot of that going on.
Right. So like at parties, in office towers, indoors, right? So if we know that focusing on street level drug arrests leads to a disproportionate arrest rate of people of color, that's the very beginning of where the disproportionality starts. We know people of color and white people use drugs in essentially the same rate, and that white folks are often dealing indoors and people of color are often dealing outdoors. And all or most of the focus is looking at let's go ahead and get folks who are outside. So that's where the disproportionality starts.
And also, I think it was just in maybe the Tacoma News Tribune about how many more people of color have been ticketed and arrested for marijuana possession, especially in their cars.
Yeah.
And how part of that is that I think because they're pulling over people of color a lot more often than they're pulling over white people.
Right.
I think they get a pass a lot.
Right. And then they go, I don't know why. Yeah. Thank you. So then individual explicit, this is where prejudice is put into action or discrimination. So one example would be a police officer calling someone a racial slur while arresting them. This is oftentimes where we see the media focus. So even though individual explicit biases can be sort of seductive and easy to get pulled into, this is not the biggest opportunity for us to leverage change. Individual implicit. These are the unconscious attitudes and beliefs. An example would be a police officer calling backup more often when stopping a person of color. What is important for us to remember about individual implicit is the cumulative effect of patterns. Frequently, it's not just an individual officer or cashier acting out of implicit bias, but many people, like over the course of time. And when we gain awareness to these patterns, either via formal research or observation, there's a great opportunity to make sure there's an institutional response. For instance, research has shown that police departments, can address this individual pattern that manifests within the institution with an institutional response, like training about implicit bias, like we're doing today, and development of policies and procedures for when officers should call for backup. Do you have any questions so far about this way of thinking about bias, these 4 sort of categories?
Is there any graphics that can show if the police officer is of a different ethnicity?
I think that data exists. We don't have it, and we're just thinking sort of high level examples.
Okay. And so the examples are basically that the police officer is probably going to be Caucasian.
I don't know that, anyone and all of us hold implicit biases and potentially explicit. So I don't know that we can make that assumption. I would say that, I don't know that we can make that assumption.
I was just trying to make sure to optimize my education about the examples.
Although I can't quote chapter and verse or even what study it was, but within the past 3 years, I did read a study similar to about blacks being stopped for traffic stops more often than whites. And as I recall, it didn't matter whether the police officer was a white police officer or an officer of color. They responded, and essentially they responded in the same way.
Yeah, I think that's true. Thank you, Tony.
I think that's an example of how the institutional and individual and systemic all, meld together. The training is going to be universal for police officers coming in, right? And so there's some institutional biases that are being taught through the process as well.
I think one of the best, I think it's institutional explicit, although you might want to draw a line there, was the study that was done about crash test dummies. That for years and years and years, crash test dummies was used to establish how we have to wear seatbelts, how you drive, all sorts of different kinds of things. And until fairly recent times, someone suggested that perhaps beside the male crash test dummies, that they should have female crash test dummies, because females are just as important as males were in crashes, safety anyway.
Oh man. Yeah, and that's a great segue to my next little point, which is this isn't just about policing, right? We know that we can find examples of implicit and explicit bias at the individual and institutional levels across all of our areas of work and service. So for example, in parks and recreation, we no longer have segregated swimming pools, but we can see implicit bias playing out based on like what neighborhoods have schools, and the planners aren't going out to make that decision. It just is how it happens when we don't ask questions. And just another reminder, we need to move beyond looking for intent and focus on impacts and income and impacts and outcomes. Look how tired I am. So now you all get to choose, you all get to practice. It's your turn. Okay, sorry. It's your turn to think about individual, institutional, and implicit and explicit biases when it comes to your work. So we're going to put you into small groups. Erin's going to, again, put you into breakout rooms to have a small group discussion, coming up with an example for all 4 columns. And it's okay if your example in the institutional explicit column is historical, like not currently happening. That's fine.
Is it,
go ahead, Martha.
is it possible to have a copy of this page to make sure to cover what's being asked of us?
We can figure that out.
I'm not trying to make it difficult. I just want to be.
No, it's not difficult at all. We're gonna put that on just a.
We can do it. I'm gonna stop sharing so that you don't have to watch me. Figure this out really quick.
Yeah, we can just put that one slide in a Google Doc that's open for folks to look at, and then put the link in the chat.
Yeah.
So be thinking, because some of this is going to come really easy and some of it probably won't. You're going to have about 15, maybe 20 minutes for this. All right, it's almost time to not be on break. If you're here, I'd love to hear if you like scary movies or if you don't like scary movies.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I'm a no also.
Absolutely.
I don't like horror, but I like
no.
I like
That's a no for me.
thrillers.
That's a no.
Psychological thrillers, creepy, but not horror, not blood and gore.
I love a psychological thriller. Okay, I'm hearing mostly no's for scary movies.
I do love Halloween, but not the scary movie part of it.
I was gonna say, but not the movie Halloween.
No, I like seeing kids go trick or treating wearing costumes.
That's fair. That's fair. All right, are we all back? For the most part, probably. There's a lot of cameras off, so I don't actually know. But I would love to hear what y'all came up with. And let's see, what I'm super curious about is the individual implicit bias that you all came up with, examples in your work.
Well, we were talking in my group about when I was a nurse when I first started nursing, I worked in OB, and how there was a lot of implicit bias institutionally and with fellow nurses regarding mothers of color and how we thought of them differently and really treated them differently. There was a lot of assumption of drug use and not taking care of themselves and not listening to them as much as we would have when they did turn out to have complications. And that took a long time to really change.
Thank you. And that's a thing that can lead kids into being put into care, right? What's happening at the hospital when.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And cause, serious complications when you're not listening to people and validating what they're, telling you.
Yeah. What else did people talk about?
I think one of the things that we talked about a little bit, but I've been thinking about it since the break, was kind of that financial bias that was mentioned earlier. When I worked for an ECAP preschool program for years. And when I first started, there was this, I'm not going to say it was institutional, but maybe it was implicit, but definitely individual, that if you're poor, you can't be a good parent.
Mm.
You know, and it didn't take me long to realize that's not true at all.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
I have one of my individual implicit bias. And I question myself about how much is bias, how much is my unconscious weighing on my need for personal safety, and how much is based on my unfounded fears based on that prejudice. For instance, when I'm going on a home visit, all right, well, I'm not going to go to that neighborhood after dark, or, you know, I'm not going to park my car here. I have to park it over here because I'm going to that neighborhood, and I better drive around. When I leave, I better go down this street, even though it's out of my way, because I don't want to go drive through that neighborhood.
Yeah, that's like all sorts of biases sort of stacked on top, right? Because some of that is you know, back in the video that we watched, she talks about stereotypes aren't problematic because they're not true. They're problematic because they're only part of the truth, right? So like you're describing a bias that is based on the information that you've been given about these areas. So that's about the stories that are shared and also the stories that are not shared. In real systemic, intentional ways of building communities where there's not resources or as much resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think you all know my magic number by now, so who else would like to share?
On the individual bias, we were talking a little bit about how we see homeless people. We make the assumption that they probably could work, but they don't want to work. And that's not true at all. So.
Yeah, thank you. Did I hear someone else?
Yeah, we talked about that also. That was one of our examples. And same with people who are addicted to drugs or alcohol. People assume that they can't function well in society. They can't get a job, they can't raise kids, but there are some functional addicts out there.
Right.
And another example related to homelessness, like just our internal unconscious attitudes and beliefs about people who are unhoused, and just like kind of trying to avoid them and not get too close. Like if we see a homeless camp, just kind of try to stay away from it, not get too close to them, because you just don't know what's going on there.
One of the things that came out in our discussion was that there just seems to be a connection between the power that the individual holds and that power, the power in the institution that's connected to that power. For instance, I was thinking of a police officer holds a lot of power, so their implicit bias could potentially have a big impact, and there might be this whole system set up around them to support whatever they've decided to do in that moment, because they've been trained to keep each other safe, and it's kind of that military training as a unit. And compared to like a kindergarten teacher who's in a huge school district, who may have called somebody the wrong name or done something out of implicit bias, who has all these checks and balances. She has a supervisor that oversees her. She has a principal that oversees her, that checks her. She's constantly pulled into training about implicit bias and all of this. And so it might happen, as it does for all of us. And it's awful that it's laid heavy on that child for that time and laid on top of all the others. But there's a good chance that it's not going to continue, possibly. Whereas the police officer, it seems like the institution would kind of support that continuing. I don't know, it just, the kindergarten teacher didn't seem to hold as much power as, I mean, still holds a lot of power in the classroom for sure. But I don't know, there was something about that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And certainly the police officer would hold a ton more power in that moment. Yeah, there's a lot of literature out there about the school to prison pipeline that you could, if you felt interested in, you could read. Teachers hold a ton of power for our kiddos. Like they're the second most powerful person for them. Yeah. I wonder how that translates into the work that you all do. So
I was going to say that you could say the same about social workers in the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. They hold a lot of authority. They have a lot of responsibility, but we can also influence some of the actions they take and certain things that they authorize.
Yeah. Go ahead, Martha.
When I met with Tony, and we were going over the various examples for the different categories, I went beyond the scope of child welfare a lot, but looking at it and listening to the people in this community that I'm in right now, brought out to me a situation where, as a guardian ad litem volunteer, being appointed to a case where it's a teenager and a mother with other children, and they came into court, both of them very angry and talking about termination, and there had been no services provided or at the time, and they were just screaming angry. Not really, but one of them was screaming angry, but the mother was just like, I'm done, kind of a thing. And my bias, my struggle was, you don't give up on a family without at least some kind of service. And I advocated that it was in the best interest of the child to not terminate parental rights until there was an opportunity to spend a little time and look into this. And in looking back on that, that was an implicit part of my beliefs and my structure. And you just don't give up on your kid or your mother unless there's lots there. And when we're in this public environment of being in the court or being in social service meetings, trying to weigh that firm belief that this needs to have more attention to it versus this is their life and we should respect what they want, since they're both wanting the same thing. I really find that to be a war within myself.
Yeah. Can folks relate to that? Look at me pretending I can see all of you. I can't. That actually feeds really well into the next slide titled, "So what do we do with bias?" Research has shown that suppressing or denying prejudice thoughts can actually increase prejudice rather than eradicate it. If instead of repressing biases, we openly acknowledge and directly challenge or refute them, we can make more progress at overcoming them. And if we identify institutional inequities and the ways that implicit biases might be impacting outcomes, we can come up with strategies to counter implicit bias, like removing names from resumes. The example that we shared earlier. I think we've heard a couple of examples of what you all have done to sort of work against the biases that come up for you. And I wanted to just share one thing that I do. Is I get real annoyed with myself when I like find a bias showing up. It shows up in all of us. You know, I've been doing this work for 20 years. It was my paid work for 5 at a giant government organization. Like, I should know better. I do know better. And yet, and so one of the things that I do is when I make an assumption about someone, when I see someone and decide that I know them or know the thing about them, I tend to challenge myself to come up with sort of 3 reasons that might not be true. So if I see, you know, a man, if I'm walking at night and I see a man on the street and I think I should cross the street because what if he harms me? I think about 3 reasons that might not be true. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but I can always practice. And so finding just a way to just sort of be curious, to question yourself, when these biases show up, I would highly encourage you to also do. And if you have things that you do that hasn't been shared today, or that you know, you wanted to share with the group, just I would ask you to please type that in the chat. I'm gonna pass it to Erin now.
And we're gonna put it into practice a little bit together right now also. Because as Mo said, we have to practice identify that we have the bias to begin with, and then what do we do with that? And instead of suppressing it or ignoring it or trying to counteract it, to really acknowledge and say, okay, what is this? How is this showing up? So if our goal is to eliminate racial inequity in our thinking and advocacy, it's important for us to consider what's driving the outcomes. Whether we are talking about high school graduation rates, employment and unemployment rates, life expectancy, or any number of other outcomes, the pervasive nature of the disparity is deep. And it isn't just individual acts of bigotry that are driving these outcomes. So now that we've been exploring some of the key terms and have awareness about our own assumptions, and we have some shared language around all this, we want to take it to the next step and see how powerful our assumptions that we make can be. And we want to introduce the ladder of inference, which some of you may have had exposure to. Have some of you seen this video or know the term, a phrase, ladder of inference? Yeah, we got one. Okay. Well, so we're going to watch this quick video. It's about 5.5, 6 minutes. And then when we come back, as you're watching it, I want you to consider times where situations like this may come up for you. And also just, you know, we're going to ask for some feedback on what you thought of it. So are you now seeing, I can't see what you see, so I'm always checking. I'm like the person on the airplane that's like, you're on this flight. If you weren't supposed to be going to Atlanta, please get off this flight. So right now, are you seeing something that says TED Ed lessons worth sharing? Awesome, amazing, okay.
Imagine a microscopic sized ladder contained in the part of our brain that will label our subconscious. The ladder of inference, which was first proposed by Harvard professor Chris Argyris, is the basis of this model. Every time we interact with someone, that experience enters the ladder at the bottom. That same experience zips up the ladder in the blink of an eye, exiting at the top. This process happens thousands of times a day without us knowing it. Let's focus on what happens on each rung of the ladder. On the first rung, we have the raw data and observations of our experience. This is very similar to what someone watching a video recording of our experience would see. Moving up to the second rung, we filter in specific information and details from our experience. We unknowingly filter based on our preferences, tendencies, and many other aspects that we believe are important. On to the third rung, we assign meaning to the information we have filtered through. This is where we start to interpret what our information is telling us. On the fourth rung, a very crucial thing happens. We develop assumptions based on the meaning we created on the previous rung, and we start to blur the distinction between what is fact and what is story. On the fifth rung, we develop conclusions based on our assumptions. This is also where our emotional reactions are created. On the sixth rung, we adjust our beliefs about the world around us, including the person or people involved in our experience of the moment. On the seventh and final rung, we take action based on our adjusted beliefs. Still with me? Great! Let's take a real-life example and run it up the ladder to see how this all works. Have you ever been cut off in a parking lot, signal light on, as you steer toward your coveted spot only to slam on your brakes at the last minute as someone pulls in front of you and steals your spot away? Imagine that experience and notice all of the data and observations landing on the first rung of your ladder. Now let's watch what we pay attention to on the second rung. Who cares that it's sunny out and the birds are chirping? The 50% off sign outside of your favorite store is meaningless. You filter in the sensation of your grip tightening on the wheel, you feel your blood pressure rise, you hear the squeal of your brakes, and you notice the expression on the face of the other driver as he pulls in front of you and quickly looks away. Time for our third rung. Ever since you were young, your parents taught you the importance of waiting in line and taking your turn. You live and die by the rule of first come, first served. And now this guy has just stolen your spot. What gives? Up to the fourth rung we go. Watch closely as our assumptions take over and our story creates itself. That stupid jerk. Didn't his parents teach him anything? How could he not see my signal light? He must never pay attention. Why does he think he's more important than anyone else? Jumping quickly to the fifth rung, we conclude that this guy is heartless, inconsiderate, he needs to be taught a lesson and put in his place. We feel angry, frustrated, vindictive, justified. On our sixth rung, we adjust our beliefs based on the experience. That's the last time I give in. Next time someone tries to cut me off, tires will be smoking on the pavement as I squeal past them into my spot. And finally, our last rung, we take action. We back up, pull up behind his car, honk our horn, and roll down our window to scream a few choice words his way. Now, imagine, he walks over quickly, apologizing. His wife, who is almost due with their first baby, called him from inside the mall to say she is in labor and needs to get to the hospital immediately. We are momentarily shocked, apologize profusely, and wish him luck as he rushes toward the entrance. What just happened here? What changed? Why is this so significant? In our parking lot example, our beliefs were short-circuited by the ladder of the other individual. My wife is in labor. I need to get there quick. There's a parking spot. Phew! Oh, geez, I cut someone off. I better apologize quickly so they don't think I'm a jerk. But what if we were able to short-circuit our ladders ourselves, proactively, by choice? Guess what? We can. Let's return to our unique human function of free will. Next time you notice yourself reacting to your experience, pay focused attention to your ladder. Ask yourself what beliefs are at play, and where did they come from? What data and observations did you filter in as a result of your beliefs, and why? Are your assumptions valid and supported by facts? Would a different set of assumptions create different feelings and result in new and better conclusions and actions? We all have our own unique ladder. Be mindful of yours and help others to see theirs.
Okay. So, can you all think of a time where you went very quickly through your ladder of inference, making assumptions? either like in your advocacy even, or times that maybe this has happened just out and about?
I think I can, when I met my first foster mom, I thought, what a wonderful person. And I was just the opposite. I had all these good thoughts about her. And then I found out she wasn't going to help with the mom and dad visitation. And she wasn't going to help with homework. And, just wasn't willing to do more than just get her to school, keep her after school. I'm so disappointed. And so I look at how I can make that better in my head now. I look at the inference, and I mean the ladder of calming down about that and just get over it.
Well, and what were some of the like data points or assumptions that you had brought forward to allow for that ladder to go the way it did for you originally?
Originally, what did I do?
Like, what are some of the belief systems or assumptions or data points that you had from before that brought you to that conclusion as quickly as you got there?
I just really thought she would be more caring, giving care to that person rather than providing some place to sleep and eat.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
So I have an example. I had a kid in foster care who'd been in there a long time, legally free. He was going to be turning 18 years old. Wasn't doing great in school at his present group home. And nobody was coming up to, adopt him. And I was like really worried, what's going to happen to this kid? And then when I met with him one time, he says, I have something to tell you, but it's in confidence. I said, well, as long as it's not a safety issue, let me hear what you got to say. And he says, he'd been online playing games and he found a family that wants to take him in. And I'm like, you met a family online playing games, video games, and they live in state far away from here. And so I said, well, you're not leaving right now, are you? He's, no. He says, they want to take me because they can't afford for adoptions and they're not going to go through the whole foster process, obviously, because I'm going to turn 18. They want to come and pick me up when I turn 18 and take them back with them. And I said, okay, well, I really need, I had all these kind of like thoughts in my head, like, oh my God, what's going to go happen here? This kid, he's been through a lot already, but he doesn't really have a lot of options coming up. So I really, had all these thoughts in my head as to why is this family, wanting to meet with this kid? I mean, he's a great kid and everything, but what's going on here? So I had a lot of strange thoughts. And then I met the family online, obviously. And I'm like, okay, I have one goal for this kid for sure, that after he turns 18, and he goes with you, if you can help with this. And it's that he finishes high school. I said, whatever happens, I want him to finish high school. And they were like all on board with it. They're like, absolutely. And so I mean, that really got rid of a lot of the crazy things that I was thinking in my head.
Thanks.
And it turned out well. He went there, he finished high school, and I see pictures of him and he's doing great.
Thanks.
I have an example from one of my cases. when I read the initial report by the social worker, I mean, it was just horrible. And the mother had a more than 15-year history of losing custody of her 3 previous children, one of which was placed for adoption. And so this is now, 15 years later, she's having her 4th child. She used meth when she was 5 months pregnant, but since that time, then she had all positive UAs when she showed up to get them. When I read the report, and then right a month after the baby was born, when she did not show up for a UA and wellness appointment, then the action was taken. She was initially referred to CPS by the hospital nurses who remembered her from the birth of her other children when she was, using and had her other children taken from her. So the nurses made this assumption that she was actively using and made the referral. When she was not, once they got all the UAs in, she was not actively using. She did, 5 months ago, but she hadn't for 5 months. And so I reading into that, once we got all the information after the fact finding, she truly has been clean for 6 months, but that according to the report that I read, it was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. But then once we get all the facts, it changed, my basic assumption or my initial assumptions.
Yeah, and I think what's important, what I take away from the ladder of inference, and one of the things that I find interesting about all of it, and that we've talked about in different capacities here, is I'm always curious about the data that I am choosing to pick up. Right. So they talked about how there's all this data going around, like in the parking example, right, that the sun was out and there was a 50% off, but you're going to move all that aside. Right. And so in the example that you were just giving, the prior data of the prior children that this person had and her prior use and all that kind of stuff is now impacting a current situation. Right. And we have to stop and be very intentional about, okay, wait, hold on. I'm supposed to be looking at the current situation. What is happening right now? I need to move all that data and put it over into the black box and send it out to sea for a while. So it's that opportunity to really stop and consider and reevaluate and check your biases on those, what data you're collecting also. Why did I choose that piece of information and not this other piece of information? So thank you, everyone. Are there other examples that folks want to bring out? We are also going to spend some time on a personal reflection here.
Yeah, I'll say something though first.
Yeah.
Please. So our job is to collect information, and somewhere along the way, I was told to ask, how do you know this to be true? And that sort of drives everybody back to their observations and not their judgments and assumptions. It's sort of in your face kind of question out here in the indirect Pacific Northwest, but it's good to ask. And the other thing, I ask myself, am I making a judgment or is there really any data to support this? And as you said, I go into a house and I get a bad vibe and I start picking up on all the negative, and then I am reinforced by what I read from the department, or I'm not. It all depends on what I start with and what's a judgment. I got a kid who I think his speech is somewhat delayed, or maybe a lot. Still trying to figure it out. And I'm a wordy guy, so I think, oh, he must therefore be behind in everything else, simply because of this. And then I start looking to blame and stop. They're all just judgments. What's an observation? And stick to that. And only say that. This is what I see.
And included in that is our own upbringing and our own biases that come from that, right? Like I have a very particular opinion of, I'm a mom also, and I have a very particular opinion of what I want my child's life to look like, that's based off of how I was raised and what my family values were and what I was told is important. It's also influenced by what society has told me, by the schools I went to, by the town I grew up in, by as I started. When I introduced myself, I have Dutch heritage. We're colonizers, and I bring that ancestry forward with me. And so not only do we have to look at the judgments we're making and the pieces of information we're taking into that, but also is that judgment, what is that judgment and that observation grounded in as well? And really check that where that comes from. And is that like a big T truth? Is that a universal truth? Is that true for absolutely everybody on the planet? There are very, very few of those things, right? We all need to breathe air. That's true, but do we all need our own bed? And does that indicate poor parenting if the person only has one bed for 2 children, 3 children, and so these are all those moments to stop and reflect and really disrupt that ladder from just being an accelerator, right? And making sure that we can take a minute and say, okay, wait, what else can I do in this? Which is precisely what I'm going to ask you to do right now. So thanks for that transition opportunity there, Mike. I'm going to put you all in our last breakout group of the day. But before we do that, I'm going to, as we do that, also going to give you a little bit, like a minute or two to just think through on your own. If you're somebody who likes to take notes, go ahead and do that. If you just want to stare at the wall and think about it, however that works for you, please do. And reflect on a situation where you have jumped this ladder as a child advocate. So particular in your cases. And if you haven't had a case yet, you can think about times where you were advocating or with other humans that needed your help or support, for example. And so you don't need to share all the details, but in your group, if you could specifically share what you can do next time, like if that example were to recreate itself again, to change that outcome and create a better outcome for the youth that you are advocating for. Does that make sense? Is that clear? I said a lot of words. Okay, so we're gonna take about a minute or two to just let you process on your own, and then I'll put you in breakout groups again and to discuss with your partner. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you came up with some ideas of how to disrupt your ladder. Things that you can do differently next time for better outcomes. If I could get 2, my goal is 2 of you to share what you discussed in your breakout room or an idea you have to disrupt your ladder. Now we're getting to the end here. People are getting real tired, but
I would say talk to your peers and talk to your coordinator.
Yep.
I liked Mo's try to find 3 alternatives.
Nice. And the Dutch person in me also likes to go to the source and just say like, oh, I was reflecting on this and I didn't manage that well. How can I show it better for you? Like, what are your ideas?
And it was in my breakout that they shared that, their data wasn't meeting with the data of the other people who were drawing different conclusions. So they, like, is this child meeting their age-related goals? Or, is the child happy? Is the child fed? Is the child clean? All those things they were using their eyeballs, whereas other people were just using their beliefs from the past, say, about this family.
It's important. Thank you. So we just have a couple more slides to go through, and we want to make this actionable. We are creatures of habit. That's a lot of what this has all been about, right? That we just keep getting reinforced in our habits. And so we're going to try and we want to break some habits. So I would like you to write down for yourself, what is one action that you can take to reduce the implicit biases that you have in advocating for youth, the youth that you advocate for. And I have a practice of putting things like this on I have a series of you cannot see, sticky notes on my computer or in like my notebook. If I have a notebook I take out with me and advocating and home visits and calling doctors and things like that, have that right there ready as your checkpoint. So take a minute and write down what's an action you can take. And if you would like to, please share that in the chat so that other people can have a bank of ideas. We can all go home with a bank of ideas of actions that we can take to reduce our implicit bias when we're advocating.
I think for me, one of the things is recognizing that I have biases, but doing a lot of reflection on why am I thinking this? Where is this thought coming from? And challenging myself along those steps, along that ladder of just really, where is this coming from?
Yeah, I have an older half brother. He's 11 years older than me. When I was young, I used to go and follow him around and go, why? Why are you doing that? Why that? Why that? Why that? And I think what I'm hearing you say is like, get really into that curious kiddo. Why? All the time. All right. Well, hopefully you have ideas that you wrote down for yourself. We have covered a lot of information. We've spent a lot of time with you this afternoon. Thank you so much for giving so much of your time to learning. And you already give so much in your advocacy and in your work as child advocates and GALs. So we really appreciate you giving time to learn and participate in things like this to make sure that you can truly be the best advocate for the youth of Washington. And we wanted to open it up for if you guys have overarching questions or specific questions that we might be able to help clarify. All right, we covered it all. You're experts. Excellent. Well, we're intentionally trying to end a little bit early to give you transition time in case you have 4 o'clock appointments as well. Our contact information is on the screen. If questions do come up as you're processing or thinking about things, please let us know. Email, contact anytime. And Ryan also has our information if you don't capture that. And we're here to help you in your advocacy for the youth of Washington. And again, thank you so much for everything you do. We really appreciate that. It's a invaluable service.
Thank you very much. Did a nice
Thank
job
you
today.
so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
you.